Good afternoon. Welcome to the Pritzker Military Museum Library's virtual learning studio in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jacqueline Moronic, the Associate Director of Education. Founded in 2003, the Pritzker Military Museum and Library's mission is to increase public's understanding of military history, military affairs, and national security by providing a forum for the study and exploration of our military, past, present, and future, with a specific focus on the stories, sacrifices, and values. With national and global reach, these spaces aim to share the stories of those who served, helping citizens everywhere appreciate the relationship between armed forces and civilians whose freedoms they protect. The virtual learning studio offers monthly webinars designed especially for teachers to use in classrooms grades 6 through 12, although they are useful for any age beyond. Be sure to sign up for our emails and go to our website for more information about upcoming programs featuring guest speakers from across the country. Today's guest speaker is Chris Kolakowski. He's the director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, an educational activity of the Wisconsin Department of Veteran Affairs. As the director, he is responsible for the award-winning museum and research center that acknowledges, commemorates, and affirms the role of Wisconsin veterans in the United States of America's military, past and present. Chris has published 3 books on the Civil War and 2 on World War II in the Pacific. He is a reviewer and contributor to the Air Force Journal of Indo-Pacific Studies and a senior fellow at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. On behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, it gives me great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Chris Kolakowski.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and welcome everybody. And thank you for taking the time to study what is, and to have some time to talk about what is a very important conflict and still one that reverberates today and actually has a lot more to it than may completely be understood. So what we're going to do today is we're going to spend a little bit of time doing a very broad, high-level survey of the Vietnam conflict. And I say the Indochina Wars because in many ways the roots of U.S. involvement in Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s actually has its roots in World War II and its aftermath. I'm looking forward to questions, and I know in an audience like this there will be some really great questions. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get going. So to understand Vietnam, to understand the conflict, we need to start with where Vietnam is and a little bit about where the conflict started. And it really started in World War II and in its immediate aftermath. Like many of the conflicts of the last 75 to 80 years in Asia, they have their roots in 1945 and immediately after. This is Asia in 1941. North being at the top, here's the continental United States and Alaska, here to the northeast, Canada, the Soviet Union, which today is Russia. Here's China. Just off to the east is Japan, with Korea in between. A little bit to the south is Taiwan, Formosa, the Philippines, where I'm circling with my cursor, the Netherlands East Indies, which today is Indonesia, British Malaya, which today is Malaysia, Siam, Thailand today, Burma and India. And then this green splotch right here is the French colony of Indochina. It's been a French colony since the 19th century, and today, and we'll talk about how this plays out, today it is the countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Here's Hawaii and Pearl Harbor. I'm circling with my cursor. From Hawaii to the Philippines is 5,000 miles. From Hawaii to the United States is another 2,000 miles, and from the Philippines over to Vietnam is another several hundred miles. So Vietnam is about as far away from the continental United States as U.S. troops can go and still be on planet Earth. So it's pretty far from home, and that's something that should be kept in mind when we think about this conflict. It's far away from home. But this is the Far East in 1941, right before the bombing of Pearl Harbor and right before the Pacific War starts. Japan attacks. It is involved in fighting all the way through 1945, and the war sweeps through Southeast Asia and then sweeps back to Southeast Asia in 1945. And by the way, the term Southeast Asia actually comes from World War II. It was codified in 1943. So that's one of the roots of this in World War II. So here's French Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Japan had invaded that actually in 1940 and then in 1941, but had kept the French administration intact. But in February of 1945, They overthrow the French administration and assume direct rule here in French Indochina. However, there is a resistance movement that develops as well. Meanwhile, the United States returns to the Philippines in October 1944 and early 1945. As a matter of fact, U.S. forces bomb the Indochina coast, some of the Japanese bases there in early 1945. And you can see British Malaya down here, Borneo, and some of the operations here in the spring and summer of 1945. At the end of the war, when Japan surrenders, the question quickly becomes, what happens to these former colonies? Do you give them back to their former colonial masters? Some of them have indigenous resistance movements. Indochina is absolutely no exception, but the French are interested in restoring colonial rule. And that conflict, that pressure of both sides is the roots of the Indochina Wars, both with the French and then later the United States. Now, everything that we're going to talk about here needs to be considered, and you need to always remember it occurs against the backdrop of the Cold War, which is developing in the years after, basically between 1945 and 1950. And it develops in Europe, but it also develops in Asia. And you'll notice the communists, led by the Soviet Union, extend their power into Eastern Europe, the famous Iron Curtain, but also into Asia. In fact, China, the Chinese Civil War, the communists win the Chinese Civil War in 1949. Korean Peninsula is divided. The northern half becomes communist as part of this. And so you've got a communist world. And then on the other side, led by the United States, with North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and some other allies as well, the areas that are in blue, they become basically the other side. And so it becomes East versus West is the shorthand for it. Everything that comes out, or what this dynamic of communism versus the free world influences and is in many ways the prism that the Vietnam War is viewed through, particularly in the United States. And so it's always important to remember when you think about Vietnam and the Vietnam conflicts, to always remember the backdrop of the Cold War, because it influences the thinking, it influences in many ways both sides. Certainly it influences the American and French side. So let's develop a little more. What are the roots for the conflict? Now that we're setting the stage, let's set the stage a little more. Japan, as we mentioned, occupied Indochina. They surrender in September of 1945. On September 2nd, 1945, the leader of the indigenous resistance, Ho Chi Minh, and I'll show you a picture of him in a minute, proclaims independence. He actually basically borrowed verbatim the U.S. Declaration of Independence. He wrote it basically word for word. Proclaims independence, the Republic, People's Republic of Vietnam, or the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But the French don't stand for this. They want to come back. They want to resume their colonial rule. Indochina had been a great colony in terms of profit for the French Empire. So they want to come back and turn back the clock to 1941. Throughout 1945 and 46, there's negotiations about a possible power sharing arrangement. There's a lot of different debates over, what can be done. The French don't want to give Ho Chi Minh a big voice in government. And ultimately, the negotiations fail. And so fighting starts in late 1946. Now, something else that needs to be mentioned, and this is something that a lot of people, particularly in both Paris and France, but also in Washington and the United States, didn't really understand. Ho Chi Minh is a communist, but he's a communist partly. He's a communist, but he's a communist to a point. At the end of the day, if there's a conflict between being a Vietnamese nationalist and being a communist, he's going to prioritize nationalism. He is a Vietnamese patriot first and foremost, is what I'm trying to say. And so his doctrine, he uses communism as a way to organize and motivate his troops and to get supports from the Soviets and the Chinese. But at the end of the day, he's fighting for Vietnamese independence. His concept is revolutionary war, and the force he uses is the Viet Minh. And revolutionary war basically is that the entire country, the entire people have a role in winning this war, both in terms of providing weapons, providing intelligence, of course, the conventional forces, guerrilla forces, and they will sustain and bear whatever burden is necessary, sustain whatever losses are necessary. And if necessary, if this war takes 10, 20, 30, 40 years, the Viet Minh are prepared to do that. They are prepared to fight for that length of time. And so that is something that needs to be kept in mind. This is a doctrine that is, it's full on, it involves everybody, and it thinks in terms of a very long time. And it is a doctrine of great determination. And this Revolutionary War concept, keep it in mind when you think about the two wars. First, the first Indochina War against the French, and then the second Indochina War against the United States. And we've already talked a little bit about some of the external factors, the fall of China to the communists in 1949. The Korean War breaks out and fights from 1950 to 1953. These add to that context that the conflicts in Indochina occur, along with the Cold War overall. So let's put some casts of characters on our stage. These are two of the prominent Vietnamese casts of characters. Ho on the right until his death in 1969, but even then he's still the spiritual leader of Vietnam all the way through the end of the war in 1975. And then his military genius on the left, Vo Nguyen Giap, who is the military mastermind of much of what we're going to be talking about here in the rest of this presentation. So that's what they look like in 1945. So let's look at what happens here in the First Indochina War. Once fighting starts in 1946, what happens? Well, the French have been ruined by World War II. The country is rebuilding. It's in very bad shape. And the last thing that the French need is a major war on the other side of the world from the home country. But that's in fact what they have. And they're not interested at this point in the first few years after World War II of losing the empire. And so, but they don't have enough troops to occupy the entire country. So what they do is they consolidate primarily around some of the cities, Saigon here to the south, Hue and Da Nang here in the center, and then the Red River Valley, Hanoi and Haiphong up here to the north, and then some outposts in the jungles as well. And basically try and fight outpost to outpost and leave the Viet Minh to be in control of everything else. The problem is that the Viet Minh are able to control, if you control the cities, but the Viet Minh are able to control the countrysides, it impacts the economy of the country, it impacts the prestige of the French, but you'll also notice all these yellow areas are where the Viet Minh ends up having major activity all throughout the First Indochina War. And you'll see how much the Viet Minh are able to control, and they effectively push the French into this hamlet around the capital of Hanoi and the port of Haiphong, and then some other areas here along the coast of what will become South Vietnam. So this basically cedes a lot of the control to the Viet Minh. And the French lack the strength to go after the Viet Minh. And even when they do send expeditions out to try and find Viet Minh units, the Viet Minh, because they control the countryside and have a good intelligence network, can get out of the way and accept battle only when they want to accept battle. So the French, even when they try, they often come up empty in their operations. By 1953, the French are running out of patience, they're running out of money, and there's no end in sight. And so they appoint a general, and I want you to remember this place right here in northwestern North Vietnam, Dien Bien Phu. We're going to talk about it here in just a second. There's a guy named Navarre, Henri Navarre, who was a noted intelligence officer and a World War II combat veteran, and he's got a plan. And he arrives in Hanoi in the summer of 1953, and his plan is to establish what he calls a mooring point at a place. He picks Dien Bien Phu, put airborne and tank units there in a force and in a place that the Viet Minh cannot ignore. And you draw them into the open, and then the French will crush them using superior firepower. That's his plan. He tries it. Dien Bien Phu is established in November of 1953. It's built up, and the Viet Minh decide, you know what, we're going to take the bait. And so they concentrate most of their army, and the Battle of Dien Bien Phu really gets going March 13th of 1954. It does not go the way the French expect, because the French, again, lacking strength, also lacking a certain amount of air power, are not able to control the roads and control the heights around Dien Bien Phu. So the Viet Minh bring in all this artillery and begin to shell the French positions, and then one after another begin to knock out the ring of French fortifications. And finally, on May 7th, 1954, this is the North Vietnamese Army, or the Viet Minh Army, raising the communist flag over the command bunker at Dien Bien Phu. And in a stroke, 10% of Navarre's army, including his elite airborne and armor units, have been wiped off the map. Huge victory for the Viet Minh. It also has a political ramification, because previous to this, there had been scheduled the Geneva Conference in Geneva, Switzerland, to talk about the future of Korea, but also to talk about the future of Indochina. And so the day after Dien Bien Phu, the day after that last picture was taken, the conference opens. And so what do you think the French situation is? They're in a very bad situation. All the leverage they thought they had going into the conference is gone with the news from Dien Bien Phu. And very quickly it becomes clear that there's no political stomach in France to continue the war. Let's find the best settlement that we possibly can. And so out of the Geneva Conference comes the partition of Indochina. And this is what happens to Indochina. This is a map. You remember the map we saw before? Indochina will be partitioned into 3 countries. You've got Laos, which is the yellow right here, with the capital of Vientiane. Cambodia, down here to the south, with the capital of Phnom Penh. And then Vietnam. Vietnam is divided provisionally, temporarily. It is divided. The communists are given the north with their capital at Hanoi. And then South Vietnam with the capital at Saigon is created down here. And the idea is this is a temporary division until the French leave in 1955. And then in 1956, there will be national elections and the country will be unified and then move forward. It doesn't work out that way. And by the way, the border between the two is the 17th parallel. That's this dashed line that you see right here, the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. So that's what comes out of the Geneva Conference. One of the things that the Geneva Conference provides is the ability for people for 300 days after the signing to go north or south if they want before the borders close. Over 600,000 people decide to evacuate what's going to become North Vietnam to the south. Another 45 to 100,000 go north, but the vast majority go south. The French and the Vietnamese are not prepared for this, and they ask for the help of the United States, particularly the United States Navy. This is actually a U.S. ship involved in evacuating Vietnamese civilians that want to go to South Vietnam. This begins U.S. involvement in Vietnam in a very major and public way. It's known as Passage to Freedom. So what happens over the next 10 years? After 1955, between 1955 and really the beginning of major U.S. involvement in 1965. The national elections are called off. There's a ruler in South Vietnam named Ngo Diem that rises. He realizes the communists might win national election, so he calls them completely off. The United States, having committed already publicly to South Vietnam, begins to send advisors, equipment, technical support, Air Force, things of that nature. Meanwhile, Ho decides to transfer the war effort to the south, creates a resistance movement down there known as the Viet Cong, supported by the North Vietnamese Army, the regular North Vietnamese Army, and we'll talk more about how that works in our next segment. Diem is assassinated in November of 1963, which sets off a period of instability and military rule in Saigon that really goes until late 65. And then in August of 1964, U.S. warships patrolling off the coast of North Vietnam engaged North Vietnamese patrol boats in what's known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. As a result of that, the U.S. Congress authorizes the U.S. President, Lyndon Johnson, who we'll meet in a minute, to use a U.S. force anywhere in Southeast Asia he determines necessary to prevent the spread of communism. And that's a significant point, to prevent the spread of communism. And that's an idea of how the United States is viewing this conflict at this point. And so the Gulf of Tonkin resolution fundamentally changes the whole situation in Vietnam and is really this major step that brings the United States in starting in 1965. It also gives us a convenient break point to take a break and see if there are any questions at this point. Jackie, I'll give it back to you for a minute or two, see if there are any questions out there. And then when you're ready, we'll pick up on part two.
Thank you, Chris. And I think you're doing such a wonderful job of taking such a broad, busy time in history in just one part of the world and making it concise and clear for us.
Thank you.
One question, we talked about the French ending up in Indochina. Are there any books that you would recommend to our participants about that, where they could learn more about that time, their colonial period?
The two best books on Indochina, and they were written years ago on the French experience. They were written over 50 years ago, are by a guy named Bernard Fall, who was a journalist. He was a French national himself and covered that war as a journalist and a scholar. And he was actually killed with U.S. forces acting as a journalist in 1967. His two books are Street Without Joy, which is a history of the entire French experience in Indochina, and then Hell in a Very Small Place, which is the discussion of Dien Bien Phu specifically, but also Dien Bien Phu and the end of the war, or the end of the French involvement in the war. There are other books that have been written since, but to my mind, if you're going to start anywhere studying the French, those are the two books that I would highly recommend by Bernard Fall. They're fantastic and still stand up today.
Thank you. You were discussing Indochina and how after the first Indochina War, it gets broken into three countries. My question here is, why are Laos and Cambodia given their own autonomy and Vietnam is divided into this very iffy circumstance where it's split in two and it's dependent on other forces besides their own people?
That's a great question. And the short answer is ethnicity. Indochina, that area is not a monolithic population. The Laotians had their own, they were their own people. The Cambodians the same way. And so basically what they do is it's kind of like other partitions that occur at similar times at that same time of the 20th century. You tend to try and draw the lines based on the ethnic boundaries.
Okay.
And so the Laotians get their own country, so do the Cambodians. Vietnam is more complex because of the competing forces north and south. And so the idea is, okay, we'll temporarily divide Vietnam and give them a mechanism to become a united country. It doesn't work out that way, but that's why they treat the Vietnamese the way they do.
Thank you. And I have two more questions from the Q&A at this point. The first, was the Gulf of Tonkin incident manufactured or overblown in order to justify U.S. military entry?
The Gulf of Tonkin incident, I'd say, because the action on August 2nd did happen. It's since come out that the action on August 4th, which the Americans believed had happened, and reported to Washington that it had happened, actually didn't. And it was a misreading of radar signatures, and basically they were firing at ghosts. At the same time, though, the Lyndon Johnson administration uses it. It's the good excuse. They've been looking for an option, particularly because Lyndon Johnson is up for re-election. He doesn't want to be seen as being soft on communism in an election year. It gives him the opportunity to say, you know what? I'm going to push for this so nobody can level the charge at me that, hey, I'm soft on communism. And it sets me apart from my opponent. So that's kind of the calculus in Washington.
Thank you. Another question, how did the fact that foreign policy run a French desk affect U.S. policy in Vietnam?
That's a really good question. It comes back, I think, to the Cold War and the overall prism of the Cold War that the United States views the conflict. The other thing that I would mention is and the book The Best and the Brightest talks about this. A lot of the Asia experts from the 40s and 50s got swept up in McCarthyism in the 1950s when McCarthy went after the State Department and accused all these people of being communists, many of them who were the Asia and Southeast Asia experts from the World War II area and in the early 50s and had worked with the French. So you wipe out all this expertise that you badly need and badly miss in the 1960s. And David Halberstam's book, The Best and the Brightest, explores this in great detail. And it's a tremendous loss for the State Department at a time that we needed it for diplomacy, policy, and planning, particularly the things we're going to talk about here in a minute.
One more question related to that. Obviously, there are so many countries that are becoming involved in conflict in this small space. And back to the Gulf of Tonkin, I understand there was some discrepancy during that time regarding international waters, that the United States was operating off the idea that it was 8 miles off the coast, and the North Vietnamese were operating off the idea that it was 12 miles off the coast, and that the United States was zigzagging freely in between those 4 miles. Do you have any thoughts or any comments on that?
I think that's a big part of it. You see that problem again and again in the Persian Gulf and some of these other contested waterways. Is where's territorial waters? Particularly when some people view it one way, some people view it the other, and that misunderstanding. If you don't appreciate those factors and what one side views as the appropriate line, what the other side views, it produces misunderstandings and it produces incidents like this. The Gulf of Tonkin is not isolated. As a matter of fact, if you look at some of the things that happened in the Persian Gulf starting in the 1980s with the tanker war, and actually I would say continuing up until very recently, particularly with Iran and some of the other bordering nations, you get the same things. These are not academic questions, and it can produce conflicts, can produce real serious incidents, and as it did here in 1964.
That is an excellent connection. Thank you, especially for students who are watching this and are probably much more familiar with what's going on in the news now versus, something that happened so long ago. So thank you for helping us make that connection. That was it for the Q&A section at this time, but please continue to type your questions in the Q&A, and we will have another round of questions at the end of Chris's presentation.
Thank you, Jackie. So let us return to our story. There you go. Let's put some new actors on our stage. The North Vietnamese actors remain the same, Ho and Giap, but now we've got some new actors. We're bringing in U.S. involvement, and these are some of the new actors and some of the key personalities for our story going forward. This is the U.S. president. This is 1966. This is the U.S. president here, Lyndon Johnson, who's from Texas. He's a politician, has made his mark in the U.S. Senate. He believes and states several times that as far as he's concerned, you can deal with anybody in the world like you can in the United States Senate, and you can make a deal just with anybody in the world. When you put that view up against Ho Chi Minh's doctrine of revolutionary war, you begin to realize he does not understand his opponent at all. And he will not understand his opponent. And that makes a difference. That misunderstanding makes a difference. The ground commander from 1964 to the summer of 1968, and really kind of the key leader of U.S. policy in Vietnam, is this man here I'm circling, is William Westmoreland. Outstanding West Point graduate, World War II veteran, Korea veteran, 4-star general, former superintendent of West Point. Considered to be a very smart general, but we'll talk about a little bit more about his generalship and strategy here shortly. And then this ultimately, through all that political disorder, once South Vietnam gives up military. This is the president of South Vietnam, basically for the entire conflict from here until 1975, Nguyen Van Thieu, who's a retired general, in some ways has been described as a general that just happened to exchange his uniform for a civilian dress to become president of South Vietnam. And this is the vice president, an air marshal in the South Vietnamese Air Force, Nguyen Cao Ky. So these are your key players from about 1965 all the way through, in Thieu's case, all the way to 1975. But these are your major decision makers. These are your major players on the U.S. side, your counterparts, if you will, to Ho and Giap that we met before. So this is the Second Indochina War. This is a good overview map to kind of frame everything that we're going to talk about here as we go forward. Here's North Vietnam. I'm circling here with my cursor. Hanoi and Haiphong, I'm circling here. Here's Dien Bien Phu. You'll see the DMZ right here. And then what I'm tracing with my cursor right now is South Vietnam, starting with Quang Tri Province and Khe Sanh here to the northwest. Hue, Da Nang, I'm circling here with my cursor. And then you've got several key port cities along the way, Chu Lai, My Lai, Phuket, Cam Ranh, and then of course the capital down here at Saigon and the Mekong Delta down here. And then the Central Highlands, we'll talk a little bit about some of the fighting there very shortly, right where I'm circling my cursor. Now, remember in the last section, I talked about how Ho Chi Minh begins to transfer the war effort to the south. And one of the ways he does that is he establishes a couple of lines of communication. And that's these orange lines that you see by sea and then up through Cambodia, which is one of the reasons the US Navy is patrolling off the coast of Vietnam, is to try and intercept that. And then the other one, which actually becomes probably the most famous and definitely the most effective, is what's known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which starts in North Vietnam and runs actually through Laos, south of the DMZ, and then begins to, at various points, I'm tracing with my cursor, debauch or push out, empty into South Vietnam. So this becomes the way, and it's an improved highway. In fact, you can drive it today. By the end, it becomes an improved highway, but it's a track. It's a very good line of communication and roadway for supplies, personnel, all kinds of things to flow from North Vietnam south to support the communist efforts in South Vietnam against the Americans and the South Vietnamese. So remember the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The other thing that should be mentioned is the war, particularly on the US side, is fought with some political limitations. And one of those limitations is the war will be confined to South Vietnam and, to a certain extent, bombing of North Vietnam. So attacking Laos, attacking Cambodia, there are strict limits on what that can be. At least in the early going. Those will be lifted later on in the conflict. It's a little bit beyond our scope today, but those will be lifted a little later. The other thing is this buffer zone along the Chinese border, which is 30 and later 50 kilometers. Don't bomb in that area. Don't go into that area, because if something bad happens, it could create an incident with China. That's the fear of the Johnson administration. But what that also does is it creates a safe haven for the North Vietnamese. They can put missiles up there. They can put air bases up there. They can put industry up there. And they know the Americans aren't going to touch them. And so that is something that needs to be kept in mind as well. The political constraints that the Johnson administration puts on the North Vietnamese. Remember, too, why is he doing this? He's trying to force the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table. He's trying to cut a deal with Ho Chi Minh. Of course, if you think about the doctrine of revolutionary war, is that a realistic, if you understand revolutionary war, is that a realistic objective? The answer, of course, is no. But it shows how Johnson is thinking about it in terms of his experience, but also thinking of it in terms of a war against communism with the backdrop of the Cold War. But keep this map in mind with everything that we're going to talk about for the rest of this section. So in March of 1965, they've been bombing North Vietnam off and on. And in March of 1965, February, March, the Johnson administration begins to make some major commitments to Vietnam, particularly on the air and on the ground. And they're going to launch an air offensive against North Vietnam to try and bomb them and force them to the negotiating table. And they need ground troops to assist. And so the Marines come ashore at Da Nang on the 8th of March, 1965. This is a picture of that happening. And it's interesting how you look at it, because this looks like it could be taken out of World War II. The World War II era landing craft, they look very much like they're wearing World War II era uniforms. And here are the Marines hitting the beach just like they did in the Pacific War. But here we are 20 years later. So the Marines come ashore at Da Nang. The bombing, the increased U.S. presence only presents more targets for the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. Doesn't quell the situation. And so by the summer of 1965, it becomes clear that either the United States is going to have to pull out of South Vietnam, or they're going to have to commit more troops to try and stabilize the situation. And the decision is made. It's called escalation. And they begin to send troops to Vietnam. This is the bombing campaign. It's called Rolling Thunder. It will begin in 1965, and it will target primarily bridges and infrastructure in North Vietnam and will be a gradually building campaign all the way through 1968. And that's, again, this is the bombing campaign that has the political constraints on it, trying to communicate, trying to provide gradual pressure, trying to get Ho to the negotiating table as opposed to necessarily a full-out bombing offensive like you saw in World War II. So the decision is made in the summer of 1965 to escalate and begin to send troops, particularly the Air Mobile Division, known as the 1st Cavalry Division later, also the 1st Infantry Division, and several other Army divisions, and then Marine divisions as well, will begin to arrive in Vietnam. And over stages over the next few years, U.S. strength is going to go up to approximately 400,000 men by 1968. So it's going to build in stages, first 180,000, and then another 100,000, and then another 100,000 on top of that, because no matter how many troops the Americans commit, it becomes clear that the situation still needs more to try and be resolved. This map shows really one of the first pitched battles after major American units have shown up. It's the Battle of LZ X-Ray, or the Ya Drang Valley. The movie We Were Soldiers Once, and the book We Were Soldiers Once and Young describes this in considerable detail. It's November of 1965, and it's really one of the first moments where, and it's in the Central Highlands. Here's Pleiku to the north, and here's the Central Highlands right by the Cambodia border, where elements of the 7th Cavalry tangle with the North Vietnamese Infantry Regiment. It's really the first time that the North Vietnamese Army has fought the Americans. Both sides kind of take the measure of each other, and both sides realize that these are formidable foes. And the North Vietnamese realize, and the Viet Cong realize, the best thing we can do is to treat the Americans just like the French and try and adopt a lot of the same tactics that we did with the French. And it worked with them. It should work again. But this is a milestone battle in the early part of the war in 1965. So 1965 turns into 1966, which goes through 1967. What happens as these troops begin to arrive? What are they doing? What's the U.S. objective? What's Westmoreland trying to do with the forces that Washington is providing him? The big tactic that he comes up with is, and he thinks of it in terms, he's a conventional guy. He's a guy who fought the Germans in World War II. Smart guy, but he looks at it in the sense of World War II in terms of conventional terms. He thinks very much like Navarre. If I can lure the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong into pitched battles, I'll win. And so that becomes what's known as attrition tactics, but also known as search and destroy. And so units will go out into the jungle, sometimes for weeks or months at a time, hunting the enemy. And when they find them, they'll fix them and then try and destroy them. Usually, just like with the French, comes up empty or comes up with less than what they expected. So how do you measure success when you're basically sweeping all around the country in a lot of the same areas again and again and again? Well, the metric he comes up with is body counts. We're going to count how many of the enemy we kill. And we're going to search for what he called the crossover point. Is at some point, we are going to kill more of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong than they can replace. We're going to kill them faster than they can send replacements down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And that'll be crossover point, and they'll be ready to call to start negotiations. They keep searching for that crossover point. It never seems to come. And as 1966 turns into 1967, and the United States watches this war on the 6 o'clock news, there's no end in sight. The U.S. public begins to sour on the war. Opposition goes from 25% in 1965, 66. 45% are polled as saying we're not sure this is really where the U.S. should be at this point. So the United States is publicly souring on the war. And that's a real problem for Johnson, particularly because he's up for re-election in 1968. He's also passing the Great Society programs. And there's a lot that he's riding on. His domestic policy rides on public support. He launches a PR blitz. There's private doubts among him and his cabinet, but as far as they're concerned publicly, the war is going great. We're winning. We're going to do great. They actually bring Westmoreland home in late 1967 for a speaking tour. And we'll talk about what he tells the American public in Congress and other places here. We'll talk about that in just a second. So that's where the United States is 1967 kind of it draws to its end. The North Vietnamese, on the other hand, sense an opportunity. The bombing has had an effect, and they realize that if it keeps going, they may have problems. They may actually start to have their strength diminished. But Thieu had a presidential election in South Vietnam in 1967, and they realized with those campaigns, hey, I think there's more division in South Vietnam than we thought. That's how they read the election campaign. And so they say, we have an opportunity. If we launch an offensive in early 1968, we have a chance to potentially turn the war completely in our favor. And they decide to do that. Giap opposes it, but he goes along with the majority decision. They decide to do it, and they decide to do it for Tet, which is the New Year, the Vietnamese New Year, January 31st, 1968. It's traditionally a truce. As far as they're concerned, that's to their advantage. By attacking during a typical truce, informal truce period, they'll catch the enemy by surprise. They'll catch the Americans and South Vietnamese by surprise. So that's how we get to 1968. But the last piece I want to put in before we get to how Tet goes is this. This is what Westmoreland is telling the United States, the people of the United States, in November of 1967. North Vietnam is unable to mount a major offensive. I am absolutely certain that whereas in 1965 the enemy was winning, today he is certainly losing. We have reached an important point where the end begins to come into view. Now, you've got a prominent, think about it, you're somebody, just an average American, prominent four-star general with the blessing of the President of the United States tells you this right before Christmas 1967. You're inclined to believe it. You're inclined to take that at face value. I want you to remember that because of what happens in early 68. LBJ visits for Christmas 1967. This is him in Westmoreland. And one of the reasons I put this picture in here is you can see how their body language has changed from the 1966 photo, particularly Lyndon Johnson. He's gotten grayer, but look at the worried look on his face. He's just gotten off the plane from the United States in Saigon. January 30th, 31st, Tet begins. This map of South Vietnam shows where all the major attacks. This is just the major attacks. This does not include the minor attacks in other smaller villages and other crossroads and fortifications and things like that. But you'll notice how the country completely erupts with the Tet Offensive. They called it the People's Uprising is what the Viet Cong called it. And so you can see how it suddenly explodes all at once, all within hours of each other around the country, from the very top of Vietnam at Quang Tri all the way down to the south. So let's see how it goes. A couple days before, 10 days before, there had been a siege of the Marines that had begun at Khe Sanh. It will last until April. There's some evidence that this may have been a decoy to try and lure some American strength to the northwest, get it out of the way for the main Tet Offensive, although there's still some debate about that. This photograph here to the south, to the bottom, is from our collection at the Veterans Museum, and it's a chaplain from Milwaukee area named Ray Stubbe. The crucifix he's using here during the siege, conducting a field church service, is now on display at the Veterans Museum. And the guy here to the right, you'll notice what's on the back of his uniform, Chicago, Illinois. So just to illustrate some points there, and you can see some of the bunkers. This becomes very much, there's fear it might become a new Dien Bien Phu, but ultimately the Marines are able to hang on. January 31st, the cities begin to burn. This is Saigon. Saigon sees attacks. Viet Cong penetrate into the grounds of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. In front of newsmen, there are attacks. There are battles that occur. Very public, some of the public images of the fighting from here. When you think about what Westmoreland had said just a few weeks earlier, and then you see photographs of this happening in Saigon, where there hadn't been really a lot of fighting, what do you think that does? Does that make an impression? Sure it does. And so this is Saigon on fire, February 1st, 1968. And so that to me is a very dramatic picture. And when you think about that's happening in the capital, and then that scene is being replicated up and down the country of South Vietnam, you can see what's happening, and it's having an effect. One of the biggest battles of Tet is the Battle of Hue, which is the ancient capital of Vietnam, is the spiritual home of Buddhism in the country. And the ancient citadel and some of the ancient, it still occupies a very prominent place even today in Vietnamese culture and national identity. It's largely taken over by the communists in early February of 1968. And then for a month in street-to-street fighting, the Marines and U.S. troops, along with South Vietnamese troops, some very good South Vietnamese troops, go house to house, block to block, and eliminate most of the communists. Some of them will escape. They will uncover several thousand mass graves of people that the communists had executed as enemies of the people. This is what Hue looks like early in the battle. This is a few weeks later, February 23rd, a U.S. observation plane over the city. You'll notice the smoke in the background. You'll notice also how destroyed and just smashed the city is. By the end, the city is in very, very poor shape. And the destruction think about what that does. And the images of that, we call it the optics today, of one of the cultural hearts of Vietnam being destroyed during the Tet Offensive. And that's the significance of the Battle of Hue. It's one of the largest battles of the entire war. And it's one of the larger U.S. Marine Corps battles since 1945. And so when you think about Vietnam, you think about the United States in Vietnam, this is a significant milepost in the road of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. So what's the effect of all this? Because Tet kind of burns out by early April, May 1968. What's the effects? What happens? Tet has shocked the United States, further erodes support. Wait, you said we were winning, is the general feeling in the country. What is this? Protests begin to increase. The protest movement begins to move. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. The Viet Cong are gutted. They lose heavily in the cities. They lose heavily on the battlefield. From this point forward, the North Vietnamese army will take a dominant role. I worked with a guy once who was a Vietnam vet, did a tour in 1966, did another tour in 1969. He said they were two different wars. And the difference was that the Viet Cong were no longer a real force in 1969. Westmoreland, for his part, declares victory, and he's got kind of a point when you consider the losses that the North Vietnamese have sustained. He asks, give me another 200,000 troops, I'll finish the war, and we'll get it done. But with the changing mood in the country, there's no way he's going to get 200,000 troops. And he doesn't get most of them. He does get a few reinforcements here and there, but most of that he doesn't get. Lyndon Johnson decides, you know what? We're going to stop the bombing, see if that lures him to the negotiating table. He also says on the 31st of March, I'm not running for re-election. And so it creates the impression, with some justification, that Tet pushed him out of office. Ceasefire negotiations do begin in May in Paris. They run for several months, ultimately to no result. Westmoreland will hand over to General Creighton Abrams in the summer of 1968 and come home to Washington. So that's the effect of Tet. In very many ways, this is a major, if not the major, turning point in the war. Talked about protests from a Chicago standpoint, particularly with the museum on Michigan Avenue. I can't not put this picture in. This is the Democratic National Convention in 1968 in Chicago. This is the Illinois National Guard facing off against protesters on Michigan Avenue in downtown Chicago. And right over here in the top corner is what's known as today as the Chicago Hilton, at the time the Conrad Hilton Hotel. So Chicago becomes a battleground in many ways of this war to a certain extent also because of the protest activity. Again, an outgrowth of Tet. So real quick, because I want to leave some time for questions, let's bring it up to 1975. Tet, we've established the turning point. U.S. troop strength actually peaks in 1969, but even then, by that point, the drawdown is beginning. It'll gradually draw down. Most U.S. ground forces will leave in 1971-72 timeframe. It's a process known as Vietnamization, create more units and more capability in the South Vietnamese army to resist the communists, and then the Americans can leave. The Air Force and the Navy will stick around for a while, ultimately until 1975 in some cases, but for the Army, Drawdown really starts in 1971. The 1st Division comes home in 1971, for example, after being there for 5-6 years. Peace talks are resumed in 1972. Look like they have a deal in October of 1972. The North Vietnamese walk away. Richard Nixon, who's the president of the United States at this point, had succeeded Johnson, bombs Hanoi over Christmas, says any political restrictions are gone, bomb Hanoi, brings them back to the table. And in January of 1973, they sign an agreement for the United States to withdraw, as they call it, peace with honor. And on March 29th, 1973, the last major U.S. ground forces leave South Vietnam. And that is why March 29th is Vietnam Veterans Memorial Day, is because that's the end of formal U.S. involvement in South Vietnam. South Vietnam will live another few years. One of the things the United States ultimately had to agree to was that the Viet Cong remained in place in South Vietnam. So that becomes the nucleus, and the North Vietnamese forces down there became a nucleus for a new offensive, which they take some time preparing, launch in March of 1975. Saigon falls April 30th, 1975, and South Vietnam is snuffed out. And Vietnam becomes a unified country, the People's Republic of Vietnam, which it is today. And so 30 years, the seeds planted in World War II in 1945, that conflict that Ho Chi Minh started in 1945 with the Declaration of Independence, ends April 30th, 1975. And that's the story of Vietnam, from colonialism all the way through to the communist victory in 1975. And so with that, Jackie, I know I covered a lot of ground. I'm sure I've got some questions. I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you so much for really making these points clear and concise. It's been very informative. We do have a few questions in the Q&A. The first one, did the Viet Cong ever recover?
It depends on how you define recover. They did get some of their strength back, but you have Viet Cong units in some cases sustained 60, 70, 80% losses. And some of them will recover, but they'll never fully recover. You know, and I didn't want to imply that they were no longer a factor, because they just disappeared. They didn't. They were always around right up until the end of the war. But whereas before they were kind of the core of the communist effort in the South Vietnam, they're no longer able to do that because of the losses. And it's not just the losses in person in fighting troops, it's the loss of leadership. And some of the spy networks and some of the other things that made them go and made them blend into the population. And so that's why the North Vietnamese army has to take over. It becomes something a little bit more of a conventional war, very much like what the French experience was before Navarre and before Dien Bien Phu.
Another question, can you explain the yin and yang between winning heart and minds and military victory?
That's a presentation in itself.
Yes.
And it's the same thing that you saw in Soviets in Afghanistan, you've seen in some of the Africa conflicts of the 1980s, you saw to an extent in Iraq and Afghanistan, is what is military victory if there's, in a conflict that involves a significant counterinsurgency like Vietnam, like Afghanistan, like Iraq. What does military victory look like? And can you win on the battlefield? In fact, Westmoreland maintained until his dying day that he's like, we won every single battle. Well, yeah, you did, but you lost the war. And so that's the other side, is the hearts and minds. And in many ways, this war is fought. And this is something that a lot of the Americans didn't understand, is they didn't understand the political nature of Revolutionary War. And they didn't understand what Ho Chi Minh was about. Ho Chi Minh was fighting this war as a political war, as an economic war, and as a military war. But I would almost argue political was probably the major line of effort. Because as long as he controls the hearts and minds, as far as he's concerned, he and the communists, that's the decisive area of operations. The United States figured that out too late. I'm not sure how many people really figured that out. When you get into that kind of conflict, where the decisive aspects of the decisive terrain, if you will, is the hearts and minds of the local people. Okay, if you accept that, how do you win that militarily? And it's not something, there have been a lot of militaries that have tried it, and I'm still not sure anybody's really been able to figure it out in most cases. There are some cases that might be successes, but in many cases, and even when they do figure it out, places like Colombia, it's long, it's messy, it's nasty, and it requires, it's messy. And it usually doesn't have a neat ending like you have in World War II, where you raise the flag, over Berlin, or you raise the flag in Tokyo with the occupation. It doesn't end that neatly. And so that makes it very complicated.
Last question coming from me in the Q&A. What got the North Vietnamese to negotiate peace terms in earnest? Was it the bombing of Hanoi?
The bombing, I'll do this very short because of time. The bombing of Hanoi got them back to the negotiating table. What really got them going was actually the Easter Offensive of 1972, when they tried a mini version of Tet using the North Vietnamese army to push against South Vietnam. But U.S. air power and the U.S. Navy, plus what ground troops were left, proved that the South Vietnamese were still extremely tough with that American support. And so at that point, the North Vietnamese said, you know what, let's try and find a way to get the Americans out of the way, and then we can finish what we need at a later time. So that's kind of the impetus to get to the negotiating table for the first time. And then the Christmas bombing gets them back after they walk away.
Thank you. So I'm going to let you go into the Q&A, and if you want to type a response there. For everybody else, I want to say on behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library and our guest speaker, Christopher Kolakowski from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, thank you for participating in today's webinar. Both museums are currently hosting exhibits around the Vietnam War. The Pritzker Military Museum and Library will host a special exhibit from May 16 through October 2nd, 2023, called Tet and the Battle of Hue. The bloodiest single battle of the Tet Offensive occurred during the fight for this city, and it was a turning point, as we learned today, that changes the course of the Vietnam War. More than 50 years after this battle, this exhibition is a powerful presentation of imagery, audio, and interactive elements that will enable visitors to experience the personal stories of the men who endured this brutal conflict. The Wisconsin Veterans Museum website also hosts a virtual exhibit dedicated to the stories of several Vietnam veterans called Our Vietnam Veterans Then and Now on wisvetsmuseum.com. I believe they also have a permanent exhibit that also highlights pieces of the Vietnam War. Today's webinar was recorded and will be available to the public on PMML's education YouTube playlist. You'll have to go to our YouTube page and find the playlist on that page. Tickets, registration, and information about more program opportunities, current and upcoming exhibits such as Tet and the Battle of Hue, and library resources are all available on our website, pritzkermilitary.org. Thank you for joining us today. This concludes our program.